Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great time at the Congress. Thanks for being here today and sorry I couldn't join you in person. I'll cover the role of animal to plant source food shifts in mitigating climate change. First of all, climate change isn't just an issue for environmental professionals to be concerned about. The World Health Organization has identified climate change as the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. And health professionals have a duty of care to current and future generations. I'm sure you've all heard of the Paris Agreement, which came out of the Conference of Parties 21 in 2015, and this requires the global mean temperature rise to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and ideally to no more than 1.5 degrees. Global temperature has already risen around 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and rising. What countries have currently committed to in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement actually takes us above 3 degrees and could be around 4 degrees if this analysis was limited to the most accurate climate models only. The emissions budget consistent with meeting the 2-degree target on our current trajectory would be almost depleted by 2030, and the budget for the 1.5 degrees would be exceeded by 2030. So there's really a substantial gap between what countries have pledged to reduce and what needs to be reduced in order to meet the targets. And if this emissions gap isn't closed by 2030, we're extremely unlikely to hold global warming to 2 degrees. The revision of countries' pledges in 2020 is the last opportunity to bring emissions in line with meeting the Paris Agreement. The coming decade is really crucial. Tackling climate change is not a far-off problem that we can forget about and leave for future generations. So we need global emissions to peak as soon as possible, followed by strong and rapid reductions before 2030. Combined with enhanced longer-term commitments. And failure to do this really locks us into relying on unproven technologies in the second half of the century. And just briefly, those unproven technologies are negative emissions technologies, and this includes things that take carbon from the atmosphere and store it. So, for example, vegetation, microbes and organic matter in the soil, and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is essentially burning plants for fuel and capturing the emissions and burying them underground. So far, most of the scenarios that meet the Paris target rely on the use of these negative emissions technologies in the second half of this century. However, there are important challenges for the large-scale application of nets. They are currently unproven at scale. They compete with biodiversity, land and water resources, and they could actually take us to an energy versus food situation. For that reason, a number of analyses have stated that nets should be considered supplementary and could be useful but cannot compensate for inadequate mitigation through other means. In the face of uncertainty over how and if the emissions reductions will be achieved, we need to apply the precautionary principle and avoid a strong reliance on these negative emissions technologies, which is really only possible by reducing emissions more steeply up to 2030. We need unprecedented action to meet these ambitious climate change targets. We're looking at needing net zero greenhouse gas emissions this century, and possibly as soon as 2050 to meet the 1.5 degrees goal. So this requires major change across all sectors. If we look at global greenhouse gas emissions, we see here that the lion's share comes from the food system, accounting for around 1/3 of all global emissions. If we go into this, the livestock sector alone contributes around half of those food-related emissions, or around 14.5% to global CO2 equivalents. In terms of carbon dioxide emissions, the livestock sector contributes 5%, which is more than all domestic shipping and aviation combined, in addition to all rail use globally. The livestock sector is also the major source of nitrous oxide and methane emissions, two very powerful greenhouse gases. And worryingly, methane emissions from the livestock sector are expected to increase by 60% by 2030, over the same time period where we should be seeing strong and rapid reductions. So a closer look at methane emissions shows us that reducing this gas is a relatively quick way of contributing to temperature goals because it has a much shorter lifetime in the atmosphere, around 10 years versus around 100 years or more for CO2. And over that time period, it delivers a very potent level of warming. So up to 86 times the warming impact of CO2, for example. And it's also responsible for around a quarter of today's warming. So methane is a very important greenhouse gas. And in fact, to achieve the Paris Agreement, methane reductions should also be addressed strongly and rapidly. So if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions across a range of high protein foods, we can see that on an equal protein basis, the emissions vary quite a lot between the different foods. And it's really at this end of the spectrum where we found the most benefits. Not only are these foods the lowest in greenhouse gas emissions, but they also have the lowest requirements for land, water, pesticide and fertilizer, have no requirements for antibiotics, don't produce manure, and also provide health benefits. And there's good news for tofu lovers. A carbon footprint analysis myself and colleagues from Loma published last year measured the carbon emissions occurring from tofu from the farm to the factory exit gate. And we found that tofu has very low emissions and is even 5 times lower than eggs, for example. And there's also good news for meat analog lovers. So this is a carbon footprint analysis that we currently have under review. So we collected recipes and production data from 3 factories in 3 countries that have all used different technology and production methods. And from a total of 57 unique meat analog products, we derived an average carbon footprint of 2.2 kilograms per kilo of product and a standard deviation of 0.6. We didn't find any consistent relationship between preparation type, for example, canned, frozen and dry. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions by diet pattern, this example from researchers at the University of Oxford using EPIC Oxford data found that the vegan diet was around 50% lower than the meat-eating diet. This analysis from researchers at Chalmers University looked at moderate and optimistic technology applications to see how much they could reduce dietary greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a complex chart because they looked at 3 scenarios for 7 diets. But I just want to draw your attention to the 2 outer columns and the current diet and the vegan diet. So for the current diet, this is where the most optimistic technologies could reduce emissions to. And over at the other end, we see for the vegan diet, the arrow is pointing to current emissions without any technology applied to reduce those emissions. And as we can see, those are already lower than where the standard diet could be taken to with the most optimistic and potentially inviable technology applied. So this is another analysis that we did at Loma Linda using the Adventist Health Study 2 data, and we looked at 3 different diet patterns, and as you can see here, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions reduces as the amount of animal products in the diet also declines. So we've seen that there can be a big difference between the greenhouse gas footprint of different foods, and that diets lower in animal products also have lower greenhouse gas emissions. But what contribution could animal to plant source food shifts make towards meeting climate change goals? So this is a question myself and a team of colleagues explored. We focused on replacing beef because beef is a food system hotspot. It accounts for around 41% of emissions from the livestock sector and contributes the same to global emissions as the entire country of India, or all of the energy used from every single building in the world. It also contributes around 17% to global methane emissions. So we worked out the impact of replacing beef with beans on a calorie and protein equivalent basis. And what we found is that if everyone in the US ate beans instead of beef, this shift alone would meet up to 75% of the US's climate change target for 2020, with no loss of calories or protein to the food system. In addition, this shift would free up an area of land 1.5 times the size of California. And we didn't actually quantify the impacts if that land was restored to its natural habitat in terms of carbon sequestration amounts, but we think that it would be significant. For example, researchers at the University of Cambridge found that restoring natural land cover combined with a 50% reduction in calories from animal products would reduce UK emissions by 80% relative to 1990. So when we think back to needing net zero emissions, that is a really significant contribution towards that goal, just from that one shift alone. So researchers from Chalmers University looked at the net greenhouse gas balance of a range of diets. So that's the emissions balance after taking into account the direct emissions from growing the food and the carbon sequestered in vegetation and soils. And as you can see here, they found that the vegan diet is the only diet that would actually result in a net negative greenhouse gas balance. So this is really significant. Net negative food systems would be a huge benefit and would free up some budget for other sectors that are harder to reduce from in the shorter term. As a contrast, if we look at the opposite of a plant-based food system, which is essentially doing nothing on livestock reduction, the livestock sector would take up to half of the emissions budget consistent with the 1.5 degree goal by 2030, and around a third of the budget consistent with the 2 degree goal by 2030, increasing to half by 2050. So why does animal agriculture have such a huge greenhouse gas footprint? Of course, there are a huge population of farmed animals, currently around 28 billion, that all require food, farm operations, they all produce manure, and some animals produce greenhouse gases directly, i.e. methane from ruminants. But the main issue is that calorie conversion, i.e. converting all of those feed crops to animal products, is very inefficient. So for example, to produce 1 calorie of beef requires 37 calories of plants. Pork requires 12 calories, chicken 9, and eggs and dairy 6. Globally, around a third of all crop calories are fed to animals, and only 12% of those calories come back to the food system. In the US, 67% of all calories are fed to livestock, and if those calories were instead fed to humans, 3 times as many people, which is around 1 billion, could be fed instead. But can technology save the day? So assessments have shown that livestock greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced by around 32% through ambitious technology and farming techniques. However, this saving will be outpaced by the increase in demand for meat, and furthermore, a more recent assessment of this figure found that only around 10% of those savings would actually be viable. So reducing the consumption of animal products is unavoidable. And that's the reason why the most recent Scientist Warning to Humanity included the promotion of dietary shifts towards mostly plant-based foods as one of the key measures to transition humanity to sustainability. And this was signed in agreement by over 15,000 scientists worldwide. So to help achieve this shift, I recommend that we need to include livestock reduction in climate change commitments to the Paris Agreement. This process should use the science, which is part of the Paris Agreement anyway, and should start by including livestock reduction in the revised commitments for 2020. This should include a declaration of peak livestock by 2020, which is in line with the need for a global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, and followed by strong and rapid reductions. And these reductions should be guided by the precautionary principle, which seeks maximum reductions from this sector in order to reduce our chances of needing to rely on unproven negative emissions technologies later on. Food shifts could be identified on the basis of best available food, which is a term adapted from best available technology in other aspects of pollution control. And this can be applied in conjunction with the worst first approach, which identifies hotspots to tackle as a starting point for the animal to plant shifts. So for example, if we look at the worst first in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions, that would be beef, followed by cow's milk, pig meat, etc. And this is at a global level, so these figures could vary by country, so they might not always be in this order. And it's worth pointing out that there's room for taking into account cultural expectations in the best available food approach. So for example, beans might have the lowest emissions, but it might be sometimes more appropriate to include substitute products such as meat analogues, rather than going for a wholesale shift to beans, for example. And as our own footprint analysis shows, that these products still have a comparatively smaller greenhouse gas footprint and still provide numerous health benefits. So in conclusion, animal agriculture is a leading contributor to climate change, and emissions from this sector are forecast to increase over a time period when we need a peaking of global emissions, followed by strong and rapid reductions. This is incompatible with meeting the Paris Agreement. We need to achieve maximum reductions from every sector in line with the precautionary principle to give us the best chance of avoiding having to rely on unproven technologies in the second half of this century. On that basis, we need to implement a wide-scale shift from animal to plant-source foods to maximize our chances of meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And this needs addressing urgently. Action over the coming decade is crucial. Countries should start by declaring peak livestock and integrating animal to plant shifts in their revised 2020 emissions reduction pledges. Thanks so much for listening. I'm very happy to take questions by email, and please enjoy the remainder of the Congress. Thank you.